In Genesis today, we are reading about God revealing to Abraham that he plans to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah because of all the evil activity going on in those towns. And Abraham questions God, if you find 50 righteous people, will you destroy the towns? No, if I find 50, God says I won't. What if you find 40? No, not if I find 40. What if you find 30? And it goes on and on, all the way down to 10. What if you find 10 people in those towns? Will you destroy it? And God says, if I find 10 righteous people in those towns, I will not destroy them. Now, anytime I've heard this mentioned, and we hear this reading pretty regularly at Sunday Mass, it seems to come up every year, even though we're on a 3-year cycle. If the priest or the deacon mentions it, it's about how merciful God is. Because the implication is if he finds even one good person, he will not destroy those towns. It's never pointed out that God does, in fact, destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, and we're about to get to that. What do we know? We know that there were no good people left in Sodom and Gomorrah. Just today in class, we talked about how God sets aside a remnant. There were 7,000 people who did not bow the knee to Baal, the false god. They still worshiped the true God. But in Sodom and Gomorrah, there were none. There may be a remnant worldwide, but in some particular places there may not be. So what's the message? As with the flood or the Tower of Babel, things can go bad. You can get to a point where it just ain't worth it anymore. And we're going to find out how bad things got in Sodom and Gomorrah soon. But I want to focus on one brief verse in Romans 12, chapter 12, verse 1. We also today are reading the beautiful 23rd Psalm, but I'm not going to comment on that. Read it in the King James translation. It's beautiful. Most people knew that psalm by heart at one point, but let's take a look at Romans. One of the things you can do, dear students, is if you find a passage that's intriguing to you and you go to Bible Hub takes things verse by verse. Bible Hub, Romans 12:1. Look at the different translations. If you look over here on the right, therefore I urge you, brothers, on account of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. Our bodies become living sacrifices in the same way that the bread and the wine become living sacrifices. So we offer our own selves, including our bodies, our flesh, as living sacrifices to Christ. But what interests me is the translation, which is your spiritual service of worship there. Here, the New International Version, this is your true and proper worship. New Living Translation, which is kind of a paraphrase. This is truly the way to worship him. You go back a little further, King James, which is your reasonable service. And the old, look at this one, Jubilee Bible 2000, which is your rational worship. I kind of like that. Douay Rheims, your reasonable service. What's going on here? Well, guess what? This is the internet, folks. You can have fun. Bible Hub is great. So you scroll down and you try to find out, what are they talking about? Your bodies as living sacrifices. This is a sort of word by word translation. So we go down to your spiritual service of worship. But the word translated spiritual here is logikane, which comes from logos, which is the word become flesh. Logos is a reasonable, rational, metaphorical as contrasted with the literal from logos, rational. And if you look a little further down, they have these commentaries. So let's look at this one. This is Ellicott's commentary for English readers. He comments on all of the phrases in Romans 12:1. When he gets to reasonable service, he says, the English phrase is somewhat ambiguous. It might mean a service demanded by reason. Well, it's a reasonable service. It's a reasonable thing to do. Such, however, is not the sense of the Greek, the original language that Paul wrote this in. but rather he's saying a service of the reason, i.e., a service rendered by the reason, just as under the old dispensation, the mind expressed its devotion through the ritual of sacrifice, the old Jewish form of worship in the temple. So now under the new dispensation in the New Testament, its worship takes the form of a self-dedication, presenting your bodies as living sacrifices, and its service consists in holiness of life, temperance, soberness, and chastity, which are reasonable, logical, rational in the broadest sense of the word. They are a service rendered by the reason. This is why we're studying Scripture. We don't just learn it. We don't just not learn it. We try to understand it, because we are to give to God a reasonable service, a logical service. We are to love him with our hearts, our minds, and our strength. The Logos, which is God himself, the second person of the Holy Trinity, is also an element of how we respond to him. We respond to him from our minds by understanding him as well as we can. We believe so that we may understand, as St. Anselm says. We can never fully understand God, of course, but understanding, reason, rationality, the Logos, is not separate from who we are. We tend to think it is because we're in a Protestant country that has been affected by an anti-intellectualism that emphasizes wrongly faith alone, as if faith could ever exist alone. It would be like saying education alone. Well, education connects you to something else. Or communication alone. Communication is two or more people talking. Faith is a relationship. And it involves our minds, because faith and reason go together. And so it is a reasonable worship, a reasonable service that we return to God in gratitude for what he has done for us, and as praising him, in our way of praising him. Okay, more tomorrow, God willing.